BBC just bottled it. And then they came out with a series of twisty explanations about when they bottled it and how they bottled it and why they bottled it. This man who has spent his whole life working for Murdoch was editor of The Sun for 2 years before that. To put him into Whitehall as a permanent secretary, it's a very odd appointment. I'm amazed that they couldn't find anybody better. Nigel Farage has a 3 times weekly show, a complete failure by the regulator Ofcom, and Paul Marshall is bankrolling this. Robbie Gibb has this enormous power and influence within the BBC. He's not impartial at all.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today with a man who almost needs no introduction. It's Alan Rusbridger, the former Guardian editor, one of the most respected journalistic voices we have in Britain, and now the editor of Prospect magazine. He's someone with a kind of unique vantage point, I think, to the power of the press in Britain, and that's the kind of subject I think we're going to be talking through today. The role of the media in British politics and beyond, and some of the threats as well of facing public interest journalism. Alan, thanks so much for joining us. I think we should just dive straight in. I kind of want to go straight into a subject that's kind of pretty current, really. You know, we've just had the news recently that David Dinsmore, the former editor of The Sun, is now going to be Downing Street's new comms chief. I guess it feels like a moment to ask, well, what does this appointment tell us about this kind of enduring closeness between politics and the press, and particularly the Murdoch press in Britain?
I think it's a weird appointment. I think it does speak to the fascination that people have had for the best part of 60 years with Rupert Murdoch and his power over politics. I just find it extraordinary that this man who has spent his whole life working for Murdoch, was editor of The Sun for 2 years, before that was editor of the Scottish Sun. It's a life dominated by a lot of very anti-Labour targeting, both of people and the party, and of his career overlapped. I'm not saying he was involved, but overlapped with a lot of the problems, the legal problems that the organisation has had. And to put him into Whitehall as a permanent secretary, who is supposed to be overseeing 6,000 communications professionals who are more or less obliged to be impartial in their work, seems to me it's a very odd appointment. I'm amazed that they couldn't find anybody better, but I think it does speak to the obsession with Rupert Murdoch, which I think has, he's 90 something now. The power that he once had is surely going, and it feels to me like a rather dated appointment.
I think there's a kind of interesting question about this too. I think that it kind of speaks to the way in which political parties, and you can see with the Labour Party still, are very, very kind of obsessed on one level with what's in the newspapers, but the reach of newspapers has declined so much, say, from the time of Tony Blair, from like 1997 to now. But yet, what's into the Daily Mail, even the Daily Telegraph, and they've changed. Their audience has changed. In many ways, they're no longer mass market products. But it feels as if politicians are still maybe behind the curve with it, but they're really kind of still really, really care and animated by what's driving Fleet Street in a way that seems to be, I think, kind of out of whack with the potential relevance of Fleet Street today.
I think that's true. I mean, the bit of me that is still a professional journalist is pleased that people still pay attention to what we write and think. And the very best journalists, of course, are still coming out with great stories and can still pack a punch. But I think it is unhealthy. I hear it time and time again from people who go into government or Whitehall and talk about the widespread fear of, appearing in an unfavourable light in the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or wherever. And you think, really, the influence that they had 40, 50 years ago was considerable and was worth paying attention to and trying to placate in ways that I think doesn't feel so true anymore.
And I think it's been really interesting. A prospect, you've at the Guardian, Nick Davies under you phone hacking. You broke the phone hack. Many stories about phone hacking in the News of the World and other outlets. On a prospect, it feels like you've continued on kind of looking critically at the British media, I think it's fair to say. You know, you're an outlet, and you yourself in your reporting and writing about this, whether it's who owns the Jewish Chronicle, and interesting, I think, a lot about the BBC, in particular the role of Robbie Gibb. Like, where do you see the BBC at now? You know, we're in the middle of 2025. Like, where do you see the BBC sitting in the kind of political landscape in Britain?
Well, I think it's crucial, and I think the more people don't know who and what to believe, and there's lots of evidence that people are losing their bearings and sense of who to believe or what to believe. There is obviously a lot of skepticism about national newspapers, which is arguably healthy. And you've got this incredibly universal broadcasting operation, which is off the scale in terms of trust. And if I were a politician, particularly if I was a Labour politician, because so much of the British press is biased against Labour, I think I would be moving heaven and earth to shore up the BBC and make sure that it is bomb-proof against whatever comes after this government. Which means sorting out the license fee. It means sorting out some governance arrangements, which means putting it on an independent footing. And I don't really understand why the Labour Party isn't doing that. At the same time, I think the BBC has got a certain loss of nerve at the moment. And it's had some pretty unhappy episodes recently where it hasn't been at its strongest. And that's a worry too. And one of the things we've been talking about on our podcast recently is who comes after Tim Davie. Tim Davie came from a marketing background. He hasn't got a journalistic or creative background. And I think that sometimes shows. And I think he would have been well advised earlier to put in someone next door to him who had a stronger editorial background. But when you look around the BBC and who might succeed him, people are really struggling to find a single person who could step into those shoes.
Were you concerned about the recent decision not to broadcast a film that they commissioned from Gaza from Ben de Pere's independent company? And the reason given for not broadcasting that was a perception of bias, rather, or perception of impartiality, I think was the language. Yeah. You know, that's something, how concerned were you by that?
Well, there were three simultaneous controversies. One was the Glastonbury one was the film where the narrator turned out to be the son of somebody who was not a very high-ranking Hamas official, but nevertheless was a Hamas official. And then this film, which they didn't broadcast, about the doctors. And although the first two got the headlines, you know, the scandal over Glastonbury and the scandal of the Hamas official, I think actually they weren't the most serious. You know, I think the Glastonbury one was a mistake, no question. People should have acted more quickly to realize that this was something that should have been taken down. The Hamas official, when the report finally came out after something like 6 months, it found one significant failing, but nothing really wrong with the film itself. But the egregious mistake, I think, was to not broadcast a film with nobody would be able to find any serious fault with it at all, which was subsequently broadcast on Channel 4 to great acclaim. And the BBC just bottled it. And then they came out with a series of twisty explanations about when they bottled it and how they bottled it and why they bottled it. And I think that was a really serious loss of nerve. And I think it betrayed an organization that has lost its editorial bearings a bit. And you're right, there's this sort of lame excuse of perceptions of partiality. Well, what is Robbie Gibb? I mean, Robbie Gibb. Sorry to go on about Robbie Gibb, but he.
No, please do. I think it's a fascinating question. It's a fascinating issue.
For those of your listeners who don't know who Robbie Gibb is, he was an unashamed, not only conservative, but goes out of the way to say, I'm a Thatcherite conservative. I'm a not sort of lily-livered conservative like Chris Patten. has chopped between politics and journalism, ended up as spin doctor in Number 10 to Theresa May. And then, when through an opaque process, the Tories have a right to nominate somebody to be on the BBC board, he was nominated and was imposed on the BBC. That to me would be like imposing Alastair Campbell on the BBC straight after stepping down from working for Tony Blair. If any such thing had happened, that would have been a scandal, rightly so, because Alastair Campbell doesn't pretend to be impartial. So you have Robbie Gibb sitting on the board, and this is, you'll have to bear with me because the talk of governance is really boring. But there's a 5-person board called the Editorial Standards and Guidelines Board, which has 3 people on it who are BBC people, Tim Davey, Deborah Turner as head of news, and Sami Ashar, the chair, and then 2 external people. And until recently, the only one of those who had any journalist experience was Robbie Gibb. So Robbie Gibb has this enormous power and influence within the BBC, and he's not impartial at all politically, but he also has this second string to his bow, which was that in 2020 he led a mysterious consortium of people to buy the Jewish Chronicle, Britain's oldest Jewish newspaper, with money and on behalf of an owner that has never been declared. I cannot remember an occasion in the history of the British press when we're not allowed to know who owns the newspaper.
It's quite remarkable. It is dark money, as we talk about on the Democracy Today a lot, but this is pretty much the clearest case.
I mean, if you think of the hoo-ha over who should be allowed to own the Telegraph, and yet nobody knows who owns the Jewish Chronicle, whether it's foreign money or British money or political money. And then the Jewish Chronicle then pivots to being this sort of Likudnik, pro-Netanyahu vehicle, which gets embroiled in a series of scandals and ethical failings while Robbie Gibb is in charge. And then shortly after, Robbie Gibb then hands over the reins of effective ownership, probably because the BBC has said that this is getting embarrassing. There's this great scandal at the Jewish Chronicle where it looks as though somebody within Netanyahu's retinue was feeding fake stories to the Jewish Chronicle, which was unquestioningly printing them. So there is Gibb, probably the most partial person you could have in politics in general and on Israel. No problem for the BBC, absolutely fine. He can sit on the main board, and they've just published the terms of reference for a review of the BBC's coverage of Israel and Gaza. Meanwhile, the BBC always says we can't broadcast that film because of perceptions of partiality. So that's where all these things knit together in a way that doesn't do the BBC any favors at all.
I guess thinking and talking about people who've got influence in the British media, another name that I think we've both been interested in is Paul Marshall. You've Prospect published some really interesting work about him, and I've been looking into him quite a lot too. And Marshall owns Unheard, he owns Spectator. He'd been rumoured to be, he had been interested in the Telegraph. He puts a lot of money into GB News, which is a seriously loss-making enterprise. Where do you see Marshall in terms of the kind of, almost in the kind of press baron mode that we have in Britain, which press barons have often looked for political influence? Where does Marshall sit in this, and how important is he?
I think he's important because GB News may have started out as a niche channel, but it's not niche anymore. And they've been very clever in sort of leveraging their broadcast output, which is controlled by Ofcom, with clipping it up into lots of stuff that goes absolutely viral on social media. So he's reaching an audience of millions and millions and millions. And it's all one way. I mean, it's all hosted by Conservative or Reform. In some cases, MPs. I mean, Nigel Farage has a 3 times weekly show. And yet this is a channel that is supposed to be regulated in the same way that the BBC is. And so this seems to me a complete failure by the regulator, Ofcom, who it seems to me have also lost their bearings. And Paul Marshall is bankrolling this, as well as the Legatum Institute, which is not very opaque, which is a pretty opaque body, best situated not in the UK but in the Middle East. And
Run
nobody,
by a New Zealand hedge fund owner who made a lot of money in Russia.
yeah. So
And they're losing significant sums of
I
money,
think
Al. I think what's
Marshall,
really,
I think they've lost 80 million at least. But
which suggests it's not a play about creating a channel that's a viable commercial product, but is a political play on some
that's
level.
what it feels like. And Marshall, who was a Lib Dem and then underwent some kind of Damascene conversion and became an ardent Brexiteer, and now seems very interested in giving wings to reform, is clearly highly interested in bankrolling all this. He's also evangelical Christian and bankrolls a lot of Christian products, Christian organizations, and things within the Church of England. So he's an interesting figure, and the thing that disappoints, I mean, I've never met him, but it disappoints me that a man who is highly educated, intelligent, and rich, very, very rich, should think that the best use of his money is turning out this conspiratorial, unfact-based, opinionated journalism designed to boost a particular brand of populist politics. I mean, is that really the best use that an unbelievably wealthy man can put his money to in 2025 in Britain today? I don't know.
It's a really interesting question. It feels very American, I have to say. Like, it feels like a much more American approach to media, and I guess there's echoes there of Murdoch and Fox and the way Fox was able to push the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think that is true. And if Ofcom doesn't act, and I think it would be quite extraordinary in the run-up to the next election if the man who might be our next Prime Minister, Nigel Farage, has 3 nights a week his own show in which he can promote all his pet policies and opinions, and no other political leader is allowed to do that. That really does feel like a sort of Fox moment.
I think it's really striking. We often talk, and I often write about electoral law and election law and things like that. And the media is something, if you talk to experts and people, political finance people, it's actually an area where they're often quite interested, but like they see it, they're a bit like, well, why is someone able to buy a newspaper and use it to do whatever they want? Like it slips outside of it, doesn't get covered by any regulations around political finance. And as you say, if you've got politicians, Nigel Farage has paid, really hefty sums of money, as are others, to present programs. Like it's a really different space to anything we've really seen in Britain. And those things, I think the online aspect of this is huge. Getting clipped, getting shared, getting pushed out into social media in ways you can't really see at all.
Yeah, the British ecosystem of media used to kind of work on the basis that you could have a Wild West in the press, and the press could be as politically opinionated as it liked. But you had the broadcasters who were sort of tent peg in the ground and who were supposed to play by different rules. Now, which is kind of the reverse in America. There you have the New York Times trying to be like the BBC and Fox News as the Wild West. But it's Ofcom is now weakening that to allow a very right-wing populist channel without any real pretense at impartiality in the way that we've understood it for decades. Then that is a very profound change. And of course, what happens is you then get a sort of general shift to the right in the media ecosystem, so that people then point to the BBC and say, well, you're not impartial because you're not where we deem the centre to be. And that puts a lot of pressure on the BBC to behave in a more right-wing way, because it's too easily accused of being woke or left-wing.
And I think it's you end up the kind of Overton window, so to speak, gets shifted in that process. I think it feels like that's what you're talking about. What's an acceptable position starts to go more and more and more get skewed by newspapers, which is something we've kind of had a history of in Britain as well, where and I understand how it happens. I'm sure you do too, where a BBC producer comes into the office, you've got the front page of every newspaper. If most of those newspapers are skewing in one direction, and you've got broadcast output going in that direction too, online, etc., that feels like what becomes the median position that they're often trying to hit. It's not that hard to do, really.
Yeah.
Think tanks, anonymously funded think tanks have been very good at this. The Tufton Street crowd and people like that we've written about a lot. It's one of the things they're really successful at is basically pushing that Overton window. And it's, I often say to people as well, if you're willing to go on the air, if you're willing to travel out to GB News' studio at any hour of the day or night, but then you're going to get on again and again and again and differ with the BBC.
Yeah. Yeah, they're clever. We had Stuart Purvis, who was a former head of ITN and was also on Ofcom, and he watched a whole week of output, and he said it's quite clever how they now do it, so that Farage will effectively dictate the terms and the subjects and the issues and how they're going to be framed, but they're careful to have somebody, a sort of a B-grade actor who will come on, so the A-grade actors will be there to promote his side of the argument, but they will have somebody, for form's sake, who will come along and put the other side of the argument in a not a very effective way. So there are very subtle ways in which you can give a veneer of impartiality while actually doing no such thing.
Alan, moving away from media manipulation into kind of into your own career a bit, we at Democracy Style, we're all about doing investigations into money and politics, which is an area you've overseen a lot of work on over the years. I was wondering, is there a story in that space, in the money and politics space, that you remember particularly fondly that you could pull back the curtain on a little bit? I'm thinking. I think behind me on the bookshelf actually is David Lee and Ed Viliami's book on Cash for Questions, which I often go back to. But is there a story in particular that kind of comes to mind?
We had an extraordinarily rich vein. I mean, I think it really distresses me when media organisations that they often chop their investigative teams because they're you know better than anybody, Peter. It's expensive, it's unpredictable, you have horrible times with lawyers, and any accountant looking at the operation always chops the investigative team first. I think on The Guardian we turned it into the business model. We had an extremely rich vein, starting with Neil Hamilton, Cash for Questions, going through Jonathan Aitken, the great mystery over who paid the Ritz Hotel boom. He was
Could you just remind the Jonathan Aitken story, just in a nutshell, Alan, because it really is quite remarkable.
Jonathan Aitken, very glamorous Tory figure. People spoke of him as being the next Prime Minister, was a cabinet minister, but had many contacts in the Middle East. And it was discovered that he had stayed at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, and that he had not paid while he was a cabinet minister. He was arms procurement minister, and the mystery was who had paid for this, because clearly it would be wholly improper for a cabinet minister to be accepting hospitality from foreign governments or foreign players. Aitken sued us. It was one of the great sort of set-piece libel battles of the late 20th century. Went on live TV, said he was going to cut out the bent and twisted cancer of journalism and with his trusty sword of truth. And we got all the way into court and were fighting it in court. His story was that his wife had paid the bill in cash in the way of English libel law. We had to prove the truth of it rather than him. And we had this extraordinary break where at the last minute, we sent a reporter to the hotel where his wife had been staying in Switzerland. And what were the chances that the hotel had gone into receivership? And the reporter said, "Could I look through all the hotel records?" And the security guy said, "Sure, they're in the basement." And he discovered a credit card that Lalicia had used to pay the bill, which had not been declared to us in court. And when we chased that credit card, we found out that she'd never been near Paris. She'd flown flown direct from Geneva to London. And it was one of the most dramatic moments in my career, certainly, but I think in courtroom history, when being there in the middle of this, multi-million-pound trial
So this is happening all around you in the High
happening. It was in
Court,
the middle of the
and
trial. At the end of
yeah,
the day, George Carman, the fearsome barrister who acted for us, handed a piece of paper up to the judge and said, "I think this might interest you, my lad." Judge immediately saw the significance, handed it down to Aitken, and I studied Aitken's face, a man who at that moment knew that his life had been destroyed, and that this massive bluff to try and silence the press had been called, and of course he ended up in prison. I mean, it was as dramatic a court case as you could conjure up.
it's quite remarkable. He was found guilty of perjury.
I mean, it was extraordinary the lengths he was going to. The next day, the very next day, he was going to put his wife and daughter into the witness box to lie on his behalf, to tell how they had made this trip to Paris. So he'd implicated members of his family as well. I mean, I've got to know him recently, and I like the man. He's been through a sort of he's found God and is a prison chaplain at the age of 81 or something. So I rather admire him now, but at the time, it was just a massive exercise in lying and trying to suppress the press.
And I think, that might sound like something from the dim and distant past, but, it's not in terms of suppressing the press. Like, we've loads of legal threats are part of what happens to anybody doing investigative journalism. And Open Democracy I was sued numerous times. We've also covered a lot the kind of issue of SLAP, strategic lawsuits against public participation. And you wrote a really interesting piece, I thought, recently, Alan, about being gagged, with a super injunction, a story involving Trafigura. Could you tell us a bit about what
Yeah,
happened
that
with
was
that?
an extraordinary story. I had heard about this company. I'd been at a journalistic conference in Scandinavia, and I came back and said to David Lee, "Would you look at this company, Trafigura? They've been accused of toxic dumping. They took a lot of toxic waste and dumped it off the coast of the Côte d'Ivoire, and they ended up paying enormous amount of damages to people whose health had suffered as a result of these chemicals being dumped." And we started to write about this, and it turned out there was an internal report, I think it was called the Minton Report, which had raised a red flag within the company beforehand, which they had suppressed. So we got hold of this report and were immediately slapped with an injunction and then a super injunction, i.e.,
And
you
you can't talk about,
you
you can't even
can't
talk about having the injunction.
exactly. So by means foul or fair, an MP got to hear about this and asked a question about it in the House of Commons, and then we had
Under parliamentary privilege.
under parliamentary privilege. Whereupon we then had an astonishing letter from Carter Rux, the go-to guys to silence the press, saying that the super injunction applied. We couldn't report Parliament. I mean, this was sort of like breaking a 300-year-old convention as to the right to report Parliament. And it was just a sort of tiny taster of the lengths that people with money will go to when you have embarrassing material to shut you up. And you're perfectly right to say that this has got worse, I think, with Russian money, Eastern European money, and people just systematically knowing that the press is now in an economically, embattled state. And I remember giving evidence to the House of Commons some years ago about this, and somebody from the local press was there who just said, to be honest, if we get a legal letter, we immediately take it down and we kill it because we can't afford to fight it. And once people either at a local level or a national level realize that the news organizations haven't got the guts or the money or the will to fight lawsuits in future, then it's an automatic way of gagging people.
Yeah, I've been really struck. Like having been through these slap cases and numerous times myself, like often politicians say they want to do something. Like Boris Johnson actually said in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine, like Londongrad is over. We're not going to be allowed. We're not going to let the libel courts be used like this. And really, very little has changed since then.
Yeah, it's been such an uphill struggle. I got obviously very interested in libel after the Neil Hamilton case, and I've got the scars on my back with so many cases that we fought over the years. And I used to talk to Harry Evans, the great editor of the Sunday Times, and he began campaigning about the libel laws and the contempt of court laws in the 70s and the 80s, and there we were 30 years later. There was one attempt to reform the libel laws in the early 2000s, which made it slightly easier. But we have nothing like the public interest defense that exists under the First Amendment. Article 10 of the European Convention, the human rights law, is very weak. And the onus, or the burden of proof is on us, which exists in no other jurisdiction that I know of. And so people know this. Rich people know that if you go to the right firm of solicitors, there's a pretty good chance that people will back down and you'll be able to cover things up.
Because it's eye-wateringly expensive. I think I was just having this conversation recently with somebody. The scale, the costs are incredible.
Unbelievable.
In other European jurisdictions, you're talking, less than €10,000 legal costs to defend a libel case.
Yeah.
In London, there's at least one case, a very high-profile case that's going through at the moment involving the BBC, that libel cost of 10 million. The case has already estimation of cost 10 million in legal costs, which is just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfair on all counts, because that means that it favors rich people over poor people, because poor people, unless they can find a firm of solicitors who will do it on a conditional fee basis, no win, no lose, no win, no pay. No, I mean, and also there's a sort of area of opaqueness about it. We got sued by Tesco, and that was a bad one for us because it began with a mistake by us. But nevertheless, it was one that we corrected very quickly, and it was an honestly made mistake. And that went on for months and months and months and cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. Because Tesco once the lawyers get their teeth into it, what's not to love about racking up, bills of £300,000 to explain to Tesco their own tax arrangements in order to turn the screw on us. And I wrote it all about. I thought, well, unless people understand what goes on here, you'll never get any public anger about it. So I wrote a long piece for the New York Review of Books, saying, more or less itemizing the bills and saying that this is what you risk when you try and do something that is in the public interest.
It's a huge issue. I think the thing as well that people don't often understand is it's the money, but it's also the time and the opportunity cost, which is a huge part of this. That the journalist who wrote that story is now going to spend most of their time dealing with a legal threat. So they're unlikely to have the time to dig into that follow-up, to do that next story, or to do something else, basically. It's a really effective way, actually. When I was at Open Democracy, we started doing a lot more writing about the legal threats we had. Myself and Mary Fitzgerald, my then editor, wrote about when Jeffrey Donaldson sued us. We wrote about when senior Kazakh elite sued us and others, because we kind of felt like, actually, do you know what? We need to talk about this, because often as well, it's something that happens behind closed doors. I'm really struck that it's happening as well, not just to journalists. It's happening to campaigners, even to people who are writing TripAdvisor reviews. But often it happens in silence, and they don't want to talk about it. They feel if they talk about it, something bad's going to happen. It'll get worse. And I think that's the thing. So it becomes a kind of quiet thing that no one wants to talk about.
Yeah. And I always admire the media organizations that are very public about it. So if you get a letter saying, strictly confidential, not for publication, there's no real reason why you can't at least make the fact of the threat known. Because if you don't do that, you're not doing any service to the readers. Or the readers, or the listeners, they should know what the threats are, and if the claimant's case is good, then there's no embarrassment, except if it's a case of privacy. That's slightly different. But if it's just a case of libel, you shouldn't be embarrassed to let people know that you're trying to clear your name.
And we published a story. I published a story a few months ago about one of the most notorious cases, I think, in these kind of slapstick cases in Britain, where Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former head of the Wagner Group, had sued Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat, a British journalist from Bellingcat. And Elliot Higgins had done the terrible thing of reporting that the Wagner Group was headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, essentially, and Yevgeny Prigozhin involved in various crimes of corruption. At the time he sued him, Mr. Prigozhin was under sanctions by the British government, and actually a sanction of the Treasury had sanctioned him, and another arm of the Treasury, the Office for Sanctions Implementation, has actually given a London law firm, Discreet Law, permission to represent Prigozhin, permission to take his money, and to sue him in court. The whole case collapsed when the tanks rolled into Ukraine, and Yevgeny Prigozhin was literally gun-toting on the front line in eastern Ukraine, and he pulled out of the case. But Elliot Higgins was left with £70,000 of legal fees, which he still never had back. And I managed to get documents showing the Solicitors Regulatory Authority taking 2 years to do an investigation and produced a three-page report that found nothing, and the law firm involved had done nothing wrong, Discreet Law had done nothing wrong, and there was nothing to see here. And again, it just set this sense in which, if that is not a textbook example of a slap case, well, what is?
Yeah, and it's very difficult to see how this is all going to change, because Keir Starmer's got enough on his plates without it making easier for journalists to write these kind of stories. And it really needs the right judgment to end up in front of the Supreme Court. And those right cases don't come along very often. They might come along once every 10 years, a case where it's so evidently that the press is in the right. And sometimes you get cases where you think, there was a Bloomberg case that, hold on, it's exciting. A Bloomberg case where it seemed to me home and dry. It seemed to me a really good case. I can't remember the exact circumstances of it, and it was all anonymized. It was something like Bloomberg versus XYZ.
I think it was XYZ. Yeah.
And they came a cropper.
Yeah, and I think in this case it was somebody they had reported previous investigations against the individual, and he had complained and wanted to get it taken down offline. And I think potentially is a really chilling effect, because it means that if you were to report, and I've had this cited to me in strongly worded legal letters, if someone's being investigated for something, which normally, Alan, in our work is a very important thing to be able to report.
Sure.
If you're a subject of interest and someone's investigating of an official body, that is no longer necessarily a legal protection, which is is potentially a real chilling effect on public interest journalism.
I think the thing is that if the public knew, most of them would be on our side. I mean, I said earlier this was our business model. I mean, we went on to do Trafigura. We did an amazing story about undercover policing, which is still rolling through the public inquiry at the moment. We did WikiLeaks 1, WikiLeaks 2. We did Snowden. We did phone hacking. We did torture and rendition. We did all. It was a sort of investigations machine at some point. And when we went to the readers and said, "Look, you're going to have to pay something for The Guardian," we decided to do it in this open way, which allowed people to read it, so you weren't putting up a closed paywall. The readers responded incredibly positively, and at the last I heard, I think The Guardian now gets something like £85 million in readers' revenue. And that's basically people saying, look, if you're going to do this kind of journalism, we will support you because we recognize the importance of it. And the reverse is also true. We can all think of newspaper titles that have scrapped any attempt at doing this kind of reporting, who, when you go to the readers and say, will you pay us, they kind of shrug and say, well, what for? Show me what you're doing that is so vital to the democracy.
I think it's a similar model that we use at Democracy for Sale, where we want it open. We want to keep the stories open so people can share them, people can read them, and we ask people to support us. And I think people see the value. I think it's very hard for news outlets that have cut and cut and cut for so long to turn around then and say, look, we need you to keep doing this, because I've seen some people online often will tweet out these, some of the stories you would get on aggregator sites, and what were proper titles who now just kind of harvest content and
Yeah.
put it out there.
Yeah.
There isn't really the public value there. Alan, of all those stories, it's such a storied, like it was an incredible few decades of The Guardian, like really huge stories. Like what's with a little bit of hindsight, what stands out to you as the kind of one that really, you look at and go, that was the one that I really won't forget.
Well, I'll give you two. I mean, where the phone hacking story was a staggering piece of reporting by Nick Davis and others at The Guardian, and is in a way still going on to this day. It's had a sort of almost 15-year afterlife, led to the Leveson inquiry, led to the payment of the payment and cost to Murdoch of well over £1 billion, and I think did lead to a change in culture in the British press, which was sliding into a pattern of criminality. That was really important. And then and on a global scale, the Snowden story, which, the first time in history that the National Security Agency had sprung a leak. And what a leak, here was a man who left the agency with hundreds of thousands of documents and gave it to us and to the Washington Post. And for about a month or 2 months, that was the biggest story in the world. And to be at the center of a gigantic global story, which was of such high importance, but also such risk and sort of moral dilemma and technical challenge was it was an amazing experience, but I didn't get much sleep during the course of it.
I could imagine you didn't. It's
Does
it's really worth going back and reading some of those stories. The Snowden stories, incredible reporting as well, and having that aspect of having that team around the world as well, people like Ewan McCaskill, and then around and able to kind of shepherd a story like that. And I guess that's really important as well, having people who've got experience and who are able to take a story like that and bring it to press.
Yeah, it was and with the government wanting to smash up all our machines, to have a sort of wall of technological air gapping so that nobody could get inside the material that we were holding inside those computers, the legal pressure, and the pressure, frankly, to beat the Washington Post, because so there was a kind of sort of journalistic pressure as well. No, it was the most complex story to do, and we got a certain amount of heat for it at the time, but I think the consensus, even amongst the intelligence world, now the dust has settled, is that we did it pretty responsibly.
We're kind of like, journalism has changed a lot since then, in terms of where not just from print to online, but the kind of plethora of one thing I guess we've seen a lot is the rise of lots of paywalls across. Actually, Guardian's one of the few places that isn't, it's got it asks for donations, but it's still pretty porous. There's a lot of paywall content now that feels like a lot of new models are emerging as well about journalism. How optimistic are you about the future of journalism and the especially public interest journalism that we care about?
Yeah. I have good days and bad days, and so sometimes you see outstanding examples of work and bravery and resilience and courage. I recently judged the European Press Prize, and there's an investigations category there, and great work being done, in throughout Europe, but maybe especially in Eastern Europe, which is not easy, but at the same time, we can all see how the economics of journalism is getting tougher and tougher, and the challenge from the tech bros and the AI robber barons is really severe now. So it's difficult to be completely calm or optimistic about a future in which people can help themselves to any amounts of content and repurpose it and then serve it up for free or serve it up on a different platform without any kind of recompense. I think some arrangement or change in the law will have to come. But meanwhile, I think it's going to be a lean pickings for a while.
And I guess I might end with this. It's a slightly cheeky one, but like, if you were starting out now, if Alan Rusbridger was a young cub reporter in 2025, like, where would you want to be? Where would you want to work? And what kind of journalism do you think you'd want to be doing? Like, what feels really vital for the moment?
Well, the most vital and at its most basic thing, a record of what happened and what didn't happen that is fact-based and believed. I mean, that's how The Guardian came into existence. Somebody was there when the Manchester cavalry rode into a crowd of protesters and hacked them to death. And he knew that the government would lie about that. And so he got a copy on the night coach to the Times. And that act of witness to say this happened, and when everybody lies about it, we have a record, is at its heart the most basic thing in journalism, and still the most important, especially in an age where there are so many people who have the means and the capability to tell lies and to muddy the waters. But sparing your blushes, Peter, I think what you're doing, that example of just saying, well, I don't need to get a job on a big flash newspaper. I don't need to, wait until somebody notices me and I can work up from the bottom rung up. I can publish myself. I can do whatever I like. I can start asking awkward questions. I can start publishing things in a blog-like format, or I can do it in video, I can do it in text, I can do it in data. I mean, the possibilities today for lightweight publishing and to be a gadfly are immense. And I think that's the most exciting thing in journalism today, that capability of reinventing journalism, which when I began in journalism, there was no question. Why would you reinvent the model? It was a very stable model. It was making lots of money, but it does need to be reinvented now. And I think, in a way, your little Substack is a beacon of how it can be done.
And thank you very much. It's very kind. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Substack today. And so thank you very much for your time. And
Great to be with you.
Thank you for all your hard work.
Great to be with you, and keep going.